Hello and welcome to our next module in our course. What we're going to be doing in this module is building on our discussion from last time when we looked at the basics of Catholic sexual ethics as rooted in natural law. And now we're going to turn to look at the first of a few specific issues in regard to sexual ethics, and that is to look at some of the debates surrounding the issue of contraception. And so that's going to be our focus here for today. Now obviously, again, this is one of those cases where unless you've been living in a hole in the ground, at least in the Catholic world, for the past few decades, you have to know that this is one of the more hotly contested issues, if not the most contested issue in the Church today, at least when it comes to morals and ethical teaching. Now in the broader culture, I'm not sure that's really the case as much. Now this did come back into the public discussion in the past few years in connection with the Hobby Lobby legal case where the new healthcare law was requiring contraceptive coverage by businesses. And so that brought back to people's attention the fact that the Catholic Church has consistently forbidden the use of artificial contraception, either the pill or condoms or any other sort of pharmaceutical or barrier method. So that came back into public discussion a little bit in that connection. But by and large, really what has happened in the culture is that we've really moved past any sort of meaningful discussion of whether or not artificial contraception is moral or immoral. It's just simply taken for granted as a fact of modern life. So it's really only within Catholic circles that this debate is still going on. Although I should acknowledge that there are some other Christian communities where people are coming back to that issue and reconsidering it. But that's still a pretty small phenomenon outside of the Catholic Church. Now within the Catholic Church, again, this really centers on the past few decades, reaching back to the promulgation of Humanae Vitae by Paul VI in 1968. And ever since that encyclical was issued, there has been a great deal of controversy surrounding it and surrounding the Church's decision to continue the prohibition of artificial contraception. Now, I'm going to give you, as part of your reading for this module, a chapter from a book by a couple of Catholic ethicists, theologians. They will give you some of the history of that. But leading up to the promulgation of Humanae Vitae, there was quite a bit of discussion and debate in the Church about whether or not the Church ought to permit artificial contraception. And really it seemed like the majority position was leaning towards allowing the use of artificial contraception. So it was something of a surprise when Paul VI issued Humanae Vitae and took the position that he did in the encyclical. And ever since then, there was a huge kind of flare-up in terms of controversy and reaction to the encyclical in the first few years following it. But essentially what happened, to really kind of abbreviate the history here, is that it produced a really kind of significant and, to this point, enduring divide in the Catholic world. And a significant percentage of Catholic theologians and Catholic lay people simply reached a position that they decided they were in fundamental disagreement with the magisterium on this issue. And so you reached a certain point where actually if you do sort of a literature search on the periodical indexes today, you find very little really dealing specifically with contraception or Humanae Vitae, because people have sort of reached an impasse. There's an entrenched opposition to Humanae Vitae and to the Church's position on the part of many theologians and many lay people. And then there is, of course, the position of the magisterium and those who affirm the prohibition. And there's not a whole lot of ongoing discussion and debate between the two sides. And so that's sort of the situation we find ourselves in. And this comes up sometimes still in Catholic circles. We hear a lot more about Humanae Vitae here in the Diocese of Wichita than many other Catholics do around the country, and so it will be up for discussion in that regard. And also, though, this is certainly an issue that comes up many times when people are entering into the church or thinking about it, because this is going to be one of the things that people find most unusual or most challenging. And so I think it's important to discuss this, not that we're necessarily going to produce a dramatic shift in the intellectual stalemate that has sort of fallen into the Catholic theological world, but I think it's important to be able to explain the reasoning behind the Church's teaching, particularly for those who are thinking about entry into the Church, or for those who are looking to perhaps consider following the Church's teaching on this matter, or who are questioning it. So it still, I think, has use, even if the academic debate has kind of hardened into a stalemate. So what I want to do then is to kind of walk through the key issues surrounding the morality of artificial contraception, talk about some of the basic reasons for why the Church has taken the position it has. Then I want to look at some of the primary challenges facing Catholics, facing people as they look to follow and understand this teaching. And then also look at some of the key arguments against it, and I'll give you an example of that in the readings. And then kind of conclude with how the Church would respond to some of those challenges, and then also some questions, I think, for us to consider moving on as we transition into the rest of the course. So that's the basic plan for this module. So then our first order of business is to turn and take a look at the basic natural law reasoning behind the Church's position. All right, then what is the basic argument against contraception that we find in Humanae Vitae and in the Church's teaching since then? Well, again, this is a big, complex issue, so we can't go into every detail of it, but I think we can get a basic overview here in the module, and then you can take a look at a couple different documents I will post for you to get your own kind of feel for the arguments. I'm going to give you, of course, a link to Humanae Vitae that I encourage you to go and read for yourself directly. And then also, I will give you a copy of a document put out by Bishop Conley in Nebraska, which is a nice kind of brief synopsis of Humanae Vitae, but integrating into that synopsis some of the development in the Church's teaching that comes out of John Paul II's theology of the body, to sort of flesh out some of the reasoning that you would find in the Church's teaching today as opposed to back in the 1960s. But really it boils down to a few basic ideas that you can find mostly already there in Humanae Vitae itself, right? So I guess maybe the first thing to say is to step back very briefly and make sure that we clarify, right, that properly speaking, the Church is not opposed to all contraception, right? So contraception would be anything that is contra conception. What the Church opposes is artificial contraception, right? That is artificially intervening in the marital act to prevent or preclude the possibility of conception occurring. And so that's really the primary issue here, right? And again, to think back to our discussion of the basics of natural law, we have to think about the object, the intention, and the circumstances, right? So in this case, the object or the act as intended that we are discussing is artificial contracepting, right? That is purposely intervening in the marital act to prevent conception, right? So this is not going to include, for example, cases where there is a medical procedure or medical treatment being used that has the unintended consequence of preventing conception, right? And so if you have a person who, for serious reasons, needs a surgery that is going to render them infertile, or if a person is on a medication for some serious ailment that is going to prevent conception from taking place, then that wouldn't really be what we are discussing here. We are discussing an action where the act as intended is I am taking a direct act to prevent conception. Some of those other issues we can talk about in discussion, or will come up again a little bit later. But really we're talking about taking the pill, using a condom, using some of the other kinds of medical devices and hormone treatments that are aimed at preventing conception from occurring in the marital act. So why is it that this is taught to be immoral by the church? Well, if you look at Humanae Vitae, the basic idea presented there is that if we look at the nature of human sexuality, if we look at the nature of sex, it is intended, as we talked about last time, to be unitive and procreative, right? And so really that is the way God designed sex to work. When you look at sex in the context of good, healthy, flourishing lives, it has those two purposes, those two ends. It is procreative, it leads to the begetting of children, and it is unitive, right? It unites the two spouses, and both symbolizes their union and actually fosters it and increases that union of the spouses. So given that we can look at the nature of sex and see those two goals, those two ends, the argument is essentially that to change the nature of sex so that it doesn't reach either of those ends, either if somebody were to forcibly have sexual contact with another person, that would be violating that unitive aspect of sex, or intervening and preventing the procreative aspect of sex. This is seen as a really kind of basic violation of nature in the sense of natural law, right? That God designed human persons to work in a certain way, and we are morally called to follow that design, right? And following that design is in fact going to lead to our flourishing. And so that's really the basic claim of a natural law reasoning behind Humanae Vitae, is that you can look at how sex is supposed to work. I mean, to put this in very simplistic terms, right? I mean, you could take a junior high biology book, right? And if you're going to look at the health book, you're going to turn to the section that deals with the parts we're talking about here. What's it going to be called? It's going to be called the reproductive system, right? So in a very basic elementary sense, we have a basic sense that these parts of the human body and those certain bodily acts are aimed at reproduction, procreation, right? And so to purposely change that is to go against human nature and God's design. So that's part of it, and an important part of it, right? But it is more than that, right? And if you look at Humanae Vitae, Paul VI says much more about why it is wrong to intervene in the marital act to prevent procreation. So we can, again, just talk about a little bit of that here, right? Because there have been entire books written on this issue. But really it comes back to this idea of human flourishing, right? That it's not just that we don't change the nature of this act in a sort of basic biological sense. It's much fuller than that, right? And it says Humanae Vitae is rooted in the idea that this nature of human sexuality that includes the possibility of procreation leads to the real flourishing of people, because it changes us on a broader scale, right? That marriage and the raising of children plays a key and crucial role in the maturation process, in the flourishing of many or most people. And, you know, again, this is something I encounter all the time in my undergraduate classes, is that it's kind of pervasive in our society today, that people think, well, I'm going to wait to get married and have kids until I'm mature, until my career is established, until I'm really ready for it. But of course, it is a perennial joke amongst married people that you're never going to be ready for it, either for marriage or for children, right? And in fact, there's kind of a deep wisdom there in some of those jokes, right? Because you don't become mature, developed adults by working on becoming mature, developed adults and then doing the things that adults do. You become a mature, fully developed adult by leading an adult life, right? By entering into the kind of things that Humanae Vitae is about, marriage and parenting. And those things actually promote that flourishing and maturing of the person. And again, right, as we all know, and as Paul VI discusses, when you separate sexuality from procreation, it short circuits all of that, right? Because for most of human history, people obviously have a strong desire to engage in sex, but that has always been, up until very recently, connected with the real possibility of procreation, right? Which has led every society, essentially, to put sexuality in the context of this stable, long-term family relationship of marriage, because it is necessary for the good of children, for the good of mothers, and also, in a less direct but real sense, for the good of fathers, right? And that the connection between marriage and those relationships and the physical act of sex and the biological fact of procreation, all of those things work together to promote the development and flourishing of the person, right? And so contraception doesn't just cut out a biological result of sex. It actually changes some of these most basic fundamental relationships that are essential to the flourishing of human persons. And again, you can read Humanae Vitae yourself and see more of what Paul VI says about that there, but I think as many people have noted, he is very prescient in terms of understanding what the consequences are going to be of the widespread adoption of contraception. So we have the nature of the biological, physical act of sex itself. We have the implications of that for the development of human persons. We also have, on a broader scale, the impact on society, right? And again, apart from just the breakdown of the family, there are further ripple effects, right, that we can see the coarsening of our culture. The fact that even though we have some real progress in terms of women's rights, we've also seen, I think you could argue pretty persuasively, a real degradation of women in our culture. That we have this weird juxtaposition of women having more legal status and rights than ever before, but also women being objectified in popular culture in a way that would have been just deeply appalling to our grandparents and great-grandparents. And much of that can be traced to this severing of sexuality from procreation and family. And again, Paul VI talks about a lot of those consequences as well. Things like the increase in abortion, things like widespread promiscuity, all of those things are connected to this. Then shifting gears a little bit, right, there are also impacts kind of directly in terms of the development of virtues in the individual, right? So we can look at the nature of the act, we can look at family relationships, we can look at broader societal impacts, but then we can reverse gears and get much more introspective again and talk about the impact of contraception on the inner person and on the development of the virtues, right? And one of the things, of course, that is comes up in the discussion of contraception is that the Church acknowledges, Paul VI acknowledges, that there are going to be instances where a married couple is going to have serious reasons for wanting to avoid conception, wanting to avoid having additional children at a particular time. And so what Paul VI lays out and what was developed much more in subsequent years is the proposal of using NFP, or natural family planning, right? That is, making use of natural cycles in fertility to allow for sexual intimacy between spouses while avoiding the possibility of pregnancy. And so that is what the Church has long proposed. Of course, Many decades ago, this was not very successful, at least for most people. In more recent years, modern methods of NFP are highly effective. Although, of course, as any, I think, honest NFP practitioner would tell you, it can call for a great deal of self-control and discipline and sacrifice on the part of married couples. NFP, using it effectively to avoid conception for serious reasons, is difficult. It requires a very serious effort at mastering one's desires and learning to deal with that sort of a challenge on a day-to-day basis, in many cases for protracted periods of time. Now, traditionally, right, this has always been understood to be part of the Christian life, right, that this battling with bodily desires, this self-mastery, is seen as a key way that we can develop virtue, right? And so temperance is one of the cardinal virtues, going all the way back to Aquinas, and before Aquinas, even into antiquity. This idea of being able to control one's bodily desires, and more specifically in this case, developing the virtue of chastity. Now, what contraception allows, of course, is really the much less need for that sort of self-control and self-denial. And it allows a couple to avoid conception and pregnancy without needing to use the same degree of temperance or chastity to attain that goal. So that's another impact of contraception, and another reason behind the Church's teaching when it comes to that. And then finally, to kind of wrap up kind of the reasoning behind the Church's prohibition, when you look at Humanae Vitae, and especially when you look at what is added to that teaching through John Paul II's theology of the body, is the sacramental aspect of sex and marriage, right? And that in marriage, and in a particular way in the marital act, which includes this possibility of procreation, the couple is really sacramental. They are receiving graces that make them more like God, and that this is not just about family relationships and developing temperance and all of that, that there is something really profound and sacred going on here that really transforms a couple in a sacramental way, right? That you are really participating in the divine life and becoming more like God through this sacrament of marriage and through the total giving of the spouses to each other in the marital act. And so that sacredness of sex is also a key aspect of the Church's teaching, and that going in and changing something that is sacred, something that really is a sacrament in a true sense, is going to be seen as not just a violation of God's natural plan for people, but as also as a violation of a sacrament. And so that too is behind the Church's teaching. All right, so we have this huge range of reasons for the Church's teaching. Everything from looking at kind of a junior high biology textbook all the way to broad impacts on society and culture, and back to the development of virtues and the sacramental, sacred nature of sex from a Christian and Catholic perspective. So when we have all these reasons that we can line up pretty clearly to argue that sex ought to be unitive and procreative, why is it that there is so much opposition to this teaching, right? And more than really any other teaching by the magisterium in recent years, this has prompted the most and the broadest scale kind of enduring dissent within the Church. So why is that, right? Especially for those maybe brought up in Catholic contexts where there is widespread acceptance of Humanae Vitae, at least in terms of public discussion, whether or not the majority of couples in any area are actually following the teaching is debatable if you look at the statistics. But for many people, it may seem surprising, right? Why is there so much disagreement about that? Well, here's where we get to the challenges aspect of the module, right? And again, there are a whole range of challenges brought up in connection with Humanae Vitae, and so we can only touch on some of them here. But I think some of the more significant ones we can at least talk about here briefly, and then follow up with that on discussion on Blackboard, right? And really, you know, one of the real things I think that prompts dissent on this issue, right, is the difficulty. You know, we just talked about a moment ago how practicing natural family planning does require significant self-discipline and development of virtues of temperance and chastity. And it's easy to say that, but in real life, it's much more difficult to actually follow through and do that. Now, for some people, right, you often hear stories about people who are trying to follow NFP and end up with babies, and there are, of course, jokes in many circles about however many NFP babies a couple might have. And so, you know, for some people that is going to be an unexpected pregnancy. It's going to be maybe a bit of a struggle financially, or in terms of time, or mental sanity in some ways. But for many couples, it's really kind of just a difficulty, an inconvenience. For other couples, though, right, there are very serious reasons for why they would seek to avoid pregnancy, right? So there are cases where there are significant health risks to a mother, say, so that there have been complications in cases with previous pregnancies. You can have a woman with multiple children already who's told by doctors that an additional pregnancy is going to put her life at great risk. In that sort of case, it is going to be a much more serious challenge and much more important to avoid pregnancy. So what does a couple do in that sort of situation? Well, again, NFP is remarkably effective when using modern methods, but it can be very difficult, right? And it can require significant periods of abstinence. And for some women, it can be more difficult than others, right? And there are situations where couples will be called on to be largely or almost completely abstinent for extended periods of time while different health issues are resolved, or while doctors work to figure out a fertility cycle. And so that can present a very great challenge to couples, right? And so I think one of the things perhaps to take from this module is to recognize that for some couples, what is asked for in terms of adherence to Humanae Vitae in these sort of very serious situations is kind of a radical call to discipleship, right? That this is not just abstaining a couple weeks every month. This can be very protracted, months-long abstinence because of a very serious risk to, say, the health of the mother. And understanding that is, I think, important when we go to talk to people who struggle with NFP, because there are couples who find themselves in this position. There are many couples who have friends or family who have been in this position, and it's going to make the church's teaching seem much more difficult to accept for them. And I think it's important to acknowledge that difficulty, and many people who are out promoting NFP, which is a good thing to do, sometimes I think downplay the difficulty. Well, I've even had people in this course, right, tell me, well, so if you have to abstain for a few years, so be it. Which I suppose there may be people who have that gift. Paul talks about different people having different gifts when it comes to that kind of self-control. But I think Paul in Scripture itself makes it very clear that for some people they don't have that gift, right? And some people who are called to the vocation of marriage may not have that natural gift of celibacy or the ability to kind of resist sexual desire without heroic effort for a long period of time. So I think it's important to acknowledge that if Scripture itself tells us this is going to be something that many people aren't going to be able to do, at least not without heroic effort, we need to acknowledge how heroic of an effort is going to require for some couples. So that would be one reason I think there's a lot of challenges to this teaching and dissent, is that it is very difficult for some couples, and I think sometimes that is not adequately acknowledged in the way the church's teaching is presented. The other, I think, kind of source of dissent comes kind of more in academic terms. So what do I mean by in academic terms? Well, in many ways this is similar to some of the discussions we've had in regard to a principle of double effect, and how there can be cases where it can be very difficult to draw the fine line between an act that is directly immoral and that we can never do, in cases where an effect is an unintended bad effect of a moral action, right? And so the classic example of this is, of course, ectopic pregnancies, where many people struggle to find this real distinction between going in a case of ectopic pregnancy and directly ending the life of the embryo versus, say, removal of a fallopian tube, which results in the death of the embryo inside. And admittedly, this is a very fine distinction, but from the perspective of natural law, it's an important one, right? It's an important one in terms of preserving the principle that we never intentionally do something that is immoral, regardless of the consequences we're aiming for, right? And I think one of the reasons there's so much dissent when it comes to the church's teaching on contraception is that there are many kind of similar cases going on here, right? And a similar difficulty in drawing this distinction, right? And if you look, for example, at the article I'll give you from scholars questioning the church's teaching, right, they're going to point to a wide range of marriages or situations where there can be couples who are married, committed to the unitive aspect of sex, but for a whole range of different reasons, there's going to be no procreative element. So you can have couples that are older where the wife is postmenopausal, so there's no possibility of procreation. Or cases where there's a medical issue of one or both spouses that is going to prevent procreation. Or you can look at, again, different medical treatments that have the unintended effect of rendering a person temporarily or permanently infertile or sterile. And the church still would say in all of these different cases that sort of marriage and marital acts within that marriage can still be moral, right? So many people would struggle with the idea of, let's say a woman has cancer, right? And a doctor determines that the only way to treat this cancer is via hysterectomy, right? This is going to render her sterile, obviously. So after that procedure takes place, that couple can, of course, still have a sexual life together, and the church would not see that as immoral, because the infertility, the prevention of conception, is an unintended effect of treating the cancer, right? Many people would see that as basically the same as situations where you have a woman who faces a very serious health risk from an additional pregnancy, or cases where a couple is in real destitution and poverty and is literally not going to be able to feed another child, or any number of other kind of very serious situations couples can find themselves in. And so it is very tempting, seems very reasonable to many people to see these as analogous cases, to see that what you are doing in this case is preserving the health of the wife, or preserving the well-being of the family and existing children, or preserving the mental health of one or both spouses, and that you are using contraception for that purpose, and therefore they would argue it's essentially the same as the case of the ectopic pregnancy, right, where they would say those are really the same act whether you remove the embryo or the fallopian tube, and in this case the hysterectomy is the same as these other cases of preserving a woman's health or a family's financial well-being or what have you. And they would argue that there's no meaningful distinction there. And again, as you'll see in the chapter I give you, they would say the church's permission for couples to use NFP as a method is again essentially the same, right? That couples are acting in a way that purposely excludes a procreative aspect to their sexual lives, right? And how is that different from using a pill or using a condom or some other artificial means of birth control? And that is really, I think, behind that kind of reasoning is abundantly clear in the chapter I will give you to read, and is behind most of the kind of academic theological rejection of Humanae Vitae and its teaching. So then, how does the church respond to that, right? And as we've probably all dealt with on one or more of these issues, it does seem to have a certain logic to it, right? There does seem to be a real close similarity, if not identity, in many of these cases. But here again is where we go back to the roots of our foundations in natural law, right? And when we go to the principle of double effect, which is what many people would use to make these kinds of arguments, there are a couple key steps there, right? One is that the act itself must not be immoral, right? And the church would argue that sex is by its nature has a certain value, a certain sacredness to it, if you will, that we ought not to intentionally change or violate, right? And so intervening to prevent procreation is seen as an intrinsic evil, right? It is something that is by its nature contrary to this basic human nature, the basic good of human sexuality, so that there is never going to be a situation where it can in fact be justified by the good effects that are being sought. And so the church's response is that if we use principle of double effect reasoning, we're never really going to get past the first step in our reasoning, because by its nature, changing human sexuality, something that is so integral to who we are as persons, is simply wrong. Now, even if we were to leave that aside for the moment, right, again, it would run into trouble in terms of principle of double effect, because in most of the cases we've been talking about here, preserving the health of the mother, preserving the financial well-being of the family, what have you, the challenge is that it is through the bad effect, it is through the blocking of conception or procreation that the good effect is obtained, right? It's not a case where we're treating a woman and it has both the good and bad effects of promoting her health and having the unintended bad effect of infertility, as we saw, say, in the case of the hysterectomy. In the case of using artificial birth control, you get the good effect, preserving the health of the mother, through the infertility, through the prevention of conception. And so, again, I think it's important not to minimize the challenge of this for many people in many situations, right? That it can really be difficult to convey this news to someone, or to make this argument to someone who is in a serious situation where there's real health risks or real financial hardship, and where people are being asked to make heroic acts of virtue to avoid those kinds of problems. All the same, right, as we have talked about before, natural law never says that we can do something immoral, regardless of how great the consequences might be. And yes, it is a very difficult teaching, but that is what the church has consistently held in terms of its fundamental commitment to the ideas of natural law. Now, before we leave this, I think that really is kind of how the argument has played out to this point, right? The church's made its argument about the nature of sex and marriage, and given this list of reasons why, according to natural law and sacramental theology, that artificial contraception is forbidden. Many people have responded to that by saying that, at least in some cases, the reasons for avoiding conception are so great that they believe it justifies intervening in the nature of marriage and the marital act. And the church's response is, well, in a pastoral sense, we acknowledge that this can be a real burden for people. It is an opportunity for growth and virtue, but it is a real burden. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, that is what our understanding of the human person and God's plan requires. And so we ought to assist people as much as we can pastorally, but not change our moral judgment because of that difficulty. And I think where one of the real challenges lies at this point then in the ongoing conversation is that when the church says this is by its nature intrinsically wrong, this intervention in the nature of sex, that is where I think many people disagree, right? And this is where kind of the ultimate point of debate is at this time, right? That the church sees marriage and sexuality as having sort of this dignity, this sacredness to it, that it is so essential to who we are as persons that we can't intervene and change it. Unlike other aspects of our bodily functions, where you can, in fact, purposely intervene and modify them for the pursuit of various other goods. But in this case, the church would say, no, you can't do that. And this is where many people in society apparently simply don't see sexuality that way, right? They don't perceive this clear and obvious intrinsic sacredness or dignity of sex and believe that we can, in fact, intervene and change the nature of sex in pursuit of other goods. And I think one of the real challenging questions is determining, is this something, this nature of sex is something we can't change without it being an intrinsic evil? Is that something we can know from natural law alone? Or is that something that requires faith? Is that something that requires revelation or belief that the Spirit is guiding the magisterium? And I think that is a real challenge for today, because if we look at the statistics, the vast majority of people have not accepted this teaching, even within those who would call themselves Catholics. Now, does that mean that this is not an aspect of natural law? No. It could be that people have such a great desire for that sexual freedom, that ability to modify their lifestyles, that they are willing to overlook and convince themselves that this is not intrinsically wrong. And I think we could point to many of the effects of contraception as sort of negative evidence for the fact that we ought not to be modifying it, right? Because when we have modified it, as our society has done, look at what the results are. And we could use that as a way to argue for that nature of sexuality being something that's intrinsically wrong to change. At the same time, right, for many of those outside of the church who don't accept the authority of tradition or the magisterium, they might acknowledge that there are a lot of problems with our culture in terms of its sexual morality, but they would say in these sort of extreme cases especially, it wouldn't be wrong to intervene and change the nature of the sexual act. And so that's really, I think, one of the big challenges is that something that can be argued for purely on natural grounds? And if so, how do we put together that argument in a persuasive way that's going to reach those who aren't already committed to accepting the magisterium's teaching? So that's one question to end with. There are a lot of other questions that have probably come up in the course of this, so I do want to go ahead and end now and then continue this discussion with you on Blackboard and just leave you with that final question and just my two final concluding ideas would be that I do think, as I've tried to present here, that there is a clear case that you can make for the church's prohibition of contraception for all the different reasons we talked about at the opening of the module. But I think it's important to acknowledge both, one, that this calls for real heroic virtue on the part of many people to live this, and we ought not to diminish that challenge. And two, is to acknowledge that for those who don't accept the magisterium's teaching, this is a really difficult concept for people to accept, and to recognize that difficulty, and to think about how is the best way to respond to that. And frankly, I think having the intellectual arguments is helpful, but I think really the best response to those questions is a lived faithfulness by Catholics and other Christians to God's plan for sexuality and marriage, right? And that really, I think, more effective than most intellectual arguments would be really great examples of people in communities, in families, in workplaces who follow this teaching and lead good, flourishing lives as a result. I think that would be much more powerful in terms of getting people to recognize the truth of this than the academic arguments, even though those are important and do have their place. So, anyways, I will leave it at that as my closing comments, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on all of this and on the readings on Blackboard.